You're not too late. You're right on time. Now is the time to sign up for Wing Women Weekend, October 15th to 18th in Provincetown, Massachusetts. This isn't just a conference, it's a lifeline for women and non-binary folks who are new to queer community. Provincetown is a place that has wrapped its arms around the queer community for decades. And when you join our group during the iconic annual Women's Week, you'll be stepping into a place where the energy is electric. Here is where you'll be seen, celebrated, and safe in your new queer identity. Sign up for the Wing Women Weekend Conference during Pride Month, and you can receive 10% off your registration when you use the coupon code PRIDE. That's PRIDE. Participants report that this experience is life-changing, and you can be a part of it. For more information and to sign up, visit wingwomenweekend.com. Hey queer friends and allies, welcome to season 6 of Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories. Here's your host, Anne-Marie Zanzel.
Hello again, everybody. This is Anne-Marie Zanzel, and I'm so excited to welcome you back to another episode of Coming Out and Beyond, LGBTQIA+ stories. And I have a storyteller with us today. I am so excited to welcome Brian Selznick to the show. Brian's book have sold millions of copies, earned countless awards worldwide, and has been translated into more than 35 languages. He broke open the novel form from his genre-breaking thematic trilogy, beginning with the Caldecott medal-winning #1 New York Times bestseller, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. Is that pronounced right?
It is.
Okay. The Invention of Hugo Cabret, adapted into a Martin Scorsese's Oscar-winning movie, Hugo. He followed that with the #1 New York Times bestseller, Wonderstruck, adapted by celebrated filmmaker Todd Haynes with a screenplay by Selznick, and then the New York Times bestseller, The Marvels. In praising his body of work, the Washington Post said Brian Selznick proves to be the rare creator capable of following one masterpiece with another. And now he has a young adult love story called Run Away With Me that was published in April 1st of this year. Is his first debut novel for young adults. This book, which includes over 100 pages of awe-inspiring illustrations, is a cinematic tour de force, transporting readers to the Eternal City as he tells the story of American teenager Danny and Italian teenager Angelo, who find each other and fall in love over one summer. And Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here with you.
That really resonates with me because when I was 17 years old, I went to Rome for the first time. My church, I was raised Catholic, we had our cornerstone blessed by the Pope, and it was Pope John Paul II. It was 1981, and I fell in love with Rome. And it was just so magical. And I was like this little girl from Connecticut who'd never been exposed to anything like that. And it was so magical. And I'm like, I'm coming back here. And then about 35 years later, I made it back. But I understand, I can just think about how magical Rome was to me when I was that age. When I went in 1981 and 2016 was so different. And maybe I got more sophisticated. I don't know, but it was just quite a different experience.
Yeah. The first time I went there was after college, which was 1988. And Rome was part of a big trip that I was doing with a friend around Europe. At the time, it was another one of the extraordinary places that we were visiting. And then I went back to visit a couple of times later. A friend of mine moved to Rome and got married there. But it wasn't until the pandemic when my husband won something called the Rome Prize, and we got to actually move to Rome for 9 months at the height of the worst of the pandemic and live in an area called Trastevere when there were no tourists, no Italians were going out. So we had this extraordinarily strange, beautiful experience where we had the city really to ourselves. And it was dangerous and scary and sad, but also beautiful and profound. And we became friends with the other Rome Prize winners who were all doing projects about Rome. And we got to hear all these great stories about the different places around the city. And those places sort of became the map for what eventually was the book.
Yes, I can imagine being in Rome during 2020 where, Italy was ground zero
Mhm.
for COVID as well. So this show is called Coming Out and Beyond. And
Yeah.
I am curious, would you like to share your coming out story with us?
So I grew up in the 70s and 80s and didn't really have any concept of queerness or queer culture or queer people. The only kids who I identified as queer in high school or middle school were other kids were making fun of. And it wasn't until I really got out of college that I began to explore things. And I still was very closeted in college. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design, where even at the time they talked about how like 90% of the population was supposed to be gay. And somehow I only knew straight people. And
Well, and our, Rhode Island School of Design, is a very queer place.
well, it turns out it is. I just didn't know it at the time. So I walked around as if I was alone on an island.
Hmm.
And the people who I was, and by attracted to, I mean the people who I became friends with were mostly straight folks and a lot of women. And I did a lot of theater up at Brown University because RISD had no theater at the time. And somehow almost everyone I knew, men and women in college, were straight. Towards the end, I became friends with a couple of people who I knew were gay, and one couple, a gay couple. But I just was not ready myself to come out. The first person I came out to was a friend of mine in college, a woman who wanted to go on a date with me. We had been friends, and I came out to her. And the first people I came out to were women I was dating who
Hmm.
I needed to either have sex with or come out
In the
to.
relationship. you know, I think about we're about the same age. I got a couple years on you, but people don't realize like how different things were in the 80s. And I do think that the visibility of the queer community deeply, deeply matters. That's why
Yeah.
your book deeply, deeply matters,
Mm, yeah.
because people need to see themselves reflected in those stories.
Yeah.
And so, part of my mission of like talking about coming out later in life is that when I came out, I thought I was the only person that
Hmm.
hadn't figured it out as a
Hmm.
teenager.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I realized, like, when I joined a Facebook group and there was 200 women in there who were all talking about the same thing that I was talking about, I was like, oh, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Because we really do need that sense of community, that sense of connection.
Yeah.
So typically in our community, in our later in life community, what we say is we talk about a catalyst. So a catalyst could be a person you fall in love with, or it can be a major life event.
Hmm.
So a lot of times, a lot of people start figuring this out after like a death of a parent,
Hmm.
a death of a child, some sort of catastrophic change in their life, or simply maybe just a divorce. And they start realizing maybe I'm not really attracted to the opposite gender. Maybe I'm attracted to the same gender. Did you have like a catalyst moment like that? All of a sudden things started to just like change for you and you realize, wait a minute, I'm not straight.
I knew I was not straight very early, right? I knew that I was attracted to boys when I was a boy, but I also knew, in quotations, at the time that was a problem. I believed that was a problem. So I forced myself, as many people do.
Mhm.
And yeah, and the women who I dated were really lovely, but eventually, there was just a kind of confusion that I engendered in them because they didn't know why I didn't want to have
Be with
sex
them.
or why I didn't want to
Yeah.
be with them.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think it was if it was a catalyst, it was a slow burning one. And I had one experience in college with a boy, but I was not ready to deal with it. And when I got to New York, I thought, now I need to start dating. I began dating. And I had several 3-month relationships throughout my 20s. That's really my pattern, was these 3-month relationships, one night stands or short events between them. Yeah, so when I finished college, I had decided I was not going to date women anymore. And so that my last girlfriend was my, I think, junior or senior year of college. And so I decided I'm going to date men. And I think my second boyfriend was someone who worked with queer young people.
Mhm.
And I visited his office
Mhm.
again because it was pretty much before the internet. Pamphlets were very popular for people
Mhm.
to take, folded pieces of paper with information on them, one of which was called How to Come Out to Your Parents. And I literally did every single thing that pamphlet told me to do, because I had a feeling that the time was coming. And when I say coming out, right, I think when people say I came out when I was this age, it means different things to different people. So a lot of times someone will say to me, I came out when I was 26, but then they'll tell me about like people of their same gender who they'd been having sex with since high school.
Yeah.
And to them, that's not coming out. But to me, having one other person know what I wanted would have been to me a kind of coming out that I wasn't ready to do. And so I think when I say coming out, I think I mean to my parents. I think it, because yes, of course there was moments of coming out to friends, and those were, I was never scared I was going to lose a friend, right? Like it was just a thing I often needed to say that I found hard to say.
So you were in the artist community.
Yes.
It tends to be quite queer friendly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Even though I, like I said, didn't seem to know anyone who was queer. Of course, it turned out everyone I knew was queer. I just show it.
It wasn't talked about back then. Like,
yeah, no. Yeah. And so for my parents, I thought for myself, it would be easier to say, Mom, Dad, I've fallen in love with someone, or I'm dating someone and his name is, as opposed to saying, Mom and Dad, I'm gay. Like, you know, it felt easier to have a specific person to identify as my boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, oh, good, I'm dating this guy. I can say, Mom, Dad, I'm dating this guy. And we broke up before I came out to my parents. So it suddenly, like, it meant I either need to wait till I'm dating someone else or I need to go. And so the momentum had been building. And I think for me, again, like, I don't think there was a specific catalyst. It was a series of moments where my parents came to my house and I had left AIDS and Its Metaphors by Susan Sontag on my bedside table. And I could see them notice something, and I could, like, there were just a series of moments like that, and being asked questions that you can't answer, or that you know you're unable to answer because you can't tell them the truth about what you're doing. And I didn't think I was going to be rejected by my parents. So I was lucky in that fashion. I thought that my mother was going to be extremely accepting very, very fast. And I thought my father was going to have a very, very hard time. And I was 100% correct. So when I finally decided it was going to happen, it's also interesting because there's so much time that we spend thinking about something we want to do. But I think for a lot of us, when the decision really gets made internally, it easy is not the right word, but it is going to happen. And it was going to happen. I was going to come out to my parents. I called them. I said, Mom, Dad, I want to come home. I want to talk to you. So I had a little setup, which I probably got from the brochure. The brochure also said to buy books for your parents to leave with them about other parents who have experienced what they're experiencing, so they know they're not alone, right? Because if you think you're the only one experiencing what you're experiencing, there's a very good chance your parents may think they're the only parents who are experiencing something like this if they don't have any other friends who have queer kids, or don't know queer people, or aren't in a queer community. So I had a bag full of books when I got back to my parents' house in New Jersey, and I sat them down and I said, Mom, Dad, there's something I want you to know. And because I wasn't dating anyone, it had to be I'm gay. And my mom immediately started crying. My dad's head kind of dropped like this. And my mom said, I love you no matter what. She may have said, we love you no matter what. And she said, I had seen the book about AIDS and Its Metaphors. I had been wondering, I thought you might be. We love you. And then my dad, with his head down, was like, finally lifted his head. He was like, well, I guess you want me to talk. And
New courses in Authentically Us, a safe online support space for women new to the LGBTQIA+ community. Maybe I'm Not Straight is a do-it-your-own pace course that examines why it can be so hard to come out. We identify 4 main reasons why coming out is a challenge for many women. In this course, we talk about divorce, deconstructing religious beliefs, internalized homophobia, and more. And for those of you who have unexpectedly found yourselves falling in love with a woman, and if that first lesbian relationship is now over, our course, When the Catalyst Relationship Ends, explores why first lesbian relationships are so impactful, why we fall in love with our catalyst so hard, and why breakups in these relationships are so life-changing. Join either of these courses today and you'll receive your first month subscription at Authentically Us for free. You'll find our courses Maybe I'm Not Straight and When the Catalyst Relationship Ends in Authentically Us. Find Authentically Us at AnneMarieZanzel.com. That's www.AnneMarieZanzel.com.
Yeah, Dad, I do.
And I said, it's up to you, whatever you would like to say. He said, well, I don't know how he phrased it. It was like, I love you and I always will. Like so he led with that.
Which is good.
Which is really good. I was crying at the time. I recognized that was good. Mm-hmm. But then he said, I want you to promise me these 3 things. And I think I did have the wherewithal to say, maybe you need to tell me what they are first before I promise. Yes. So he said, first, I don't want anyone else knowing. And I was like, well, Dad, I'm literally coming out right now. Like the point of this is for people to know. So I think other people are going to know. I'm going to I think I'd already told my sister by this point, but I'm going to need to tell my brother. I'm going to need to tell their partners. Their husbands and wives. I want to tell our family. So that probably isn't something I can totally promise. And I think for him, it became about work. I just think he got worried about people at work judging him in some fashion. And then he said, second of all, I don't want you acting gay. And I was like, am I acting gay right now? Like what? I don't know what that means exactly. Like,
it probably means the more effusive members of our community.
Maybe he had some bad associations.
Yeah.
And then he said, you can't ever bring anybody home.
Did that break
I was crying this entire time, right? I'm laughing, retelling the story because, I've healed and, the spoiler alert is before he died, he did come around. But at the time I was like, Dad, and I was single at the time, right? So it wasn't actually an issue. And I said, so are you telling me that if Holly gets engaged, my sister gets engaged, and I'm dating someone, I can't bring them to the wedding? And he said, absolutely not. And I was like, okay, it's not an issue right now, but I think maybe we better hold off on this one. So my sister got married. I was single. It wasn't an issbut that's right. But my brother was not married at the time. And so later, by the time he got engaged, I was with the person who I am still with, my husband, David. I met him when I was 30. We just had our 28th anniversary of being together. He was the first person I ever dated longer than 3 months. When we got to 6 months, I was like, oh my God, this is so long.
I'm supposed to marry you.
It did take 18 years for us to get married, but gay marriage also wasn't available for most of that time.
It wasn't. Yeah, true. Yeah.
But I did know on the first date that I wanted to be with him. So I had a sense that I wanted to be with him for the rest of my life. So by the time I had met David, my dad was okay. And my parents invited me and David to come to New Jersey to meet them. And there were these amazing coincidences. Like my husband was a graduate student when I met him, working on a PhD about the history of plastic surgery. And there was a group of young women who had been injured in the bombing of Hiroshima who came to America for free reconstructive surgery. They were called the Hiroshima Maidens. And my dad said, oh, my cousin was one of their surgeons.
Wow.
That this extraordinary connection happened. And there was another crisis around my brother's wedding because my dad, knowing that by that point he couldn't stop David from coming, told me through my mother that he did not want me touching David at the wedding. And which I could not promise. So a series of escalating crises happened that I felt like as queer people in straight families, I think we often are the crisis managers. I think we are often the ones who are keeping the peace. Even though our own queerness might itself cause a crisis.
The perception of the priest.
But we are often the ones who are keeping everyone together, or at least that's often how it feels, I think, to a lot of us. And so in the end, I ended up I should rephrase that. I ended up deciding to not touch David at the wedding. But I said to my father, what you're asking me to do is terrible. And one day you are going to apologize to me. And because this is about you, it's not about me.
It's your dad's homophobia.
It's your homophobia. You grew up in the 50s. I can totally understand where your homophobia is coming from. But because he also said he didn't want me touching David in their house. He probably saw me, I may have kissed David on the lips once briefly, in their living room.
But he would never ask your siblings to do
Exactly.
that. Never in a million years would he ask your siblings to do that.
In fact, that became part of a conversation I had with my siblings, because I made this promise. But I also said to them, I'm never coming to your house either again with this rule. You can come to my house, under which there is no rule. And so I can't guarantee what you're going to see, but I'm not coming home again. And my mom could not bear that. So after the wedding, they essentially had an intervention. And I did have to have a conversation, sort of making it clear to, my brother about sort of why this was serious, and the fact that he would never, like you just said, he would never ask this.
No, he would never ask your siblings to do that.
And I think my brother was very young at the time, and I think he couldn't quite wrap his mind around why that was so horrible. And his wife, who isn't Jewish, we're Jewish, said to him, imagine bringing me home and having your dad say, I don't want you kissing her in front of me because she's not Jewish. And then my brother was like, oh, that's bad. And so it's like, see, like sometimes we just need to be able to sort of put ourselves in a situation that maybe we think we can connect with, because we can. Like there are ways to find ourselves in any situation imaginatively. And my dad, they had this full-on intervention with him. And to his credit, he invited me home and said that he was really sorry. It was all his homophobia. He recognized it. He wanted me and David to come. There was no rule about what we could or couldn't do. And let's go have lunch. And so he died not that long after that, but I was very glad that we had a good rapprochement before he left.
So when we started talking today, I mentioned your 3 big books, which were the Invention of Hugo Cabret, Wonderstruck, and The Marvels. And you proceeded to say, actually, those are my 24th, 25th, 26th, something like that, books that you've written. I am curious, as a queer person, how this whole story with your dad influenced your writing. Because most of us just want to be accepted by our parents for who we are. I was very fortunate. My parents were gone by the time I came out, so I never had to come out to them.
Right.
I did have siblings, but I also was a grown-ass woman, and if my siblings were going to reject me because of that, I was actually sort of okay with it. I mean, that sort of happened. Some of them are back now, but But I'm curious, as you started, so you're in the middle of starting this career, you're an illustrator. And how did this whole side story of really not being accepted by someone you love dearly affect you in the beginning of the storytelling?
Yeah, so I knew my parents loved me, and I knew that I had support from them, right? And my dad had also been a big sports guy in high school, and it was always sort of painful for me to not like sports and know that I didn't have that connection. In fact, my brother was a big sports guy. So when he came around, it actually was a relief to me that my dad had someone he could enjoy sports with, which I was very happy about. And my first, I think the story I just told you and the publication of my first book were around the same time. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the way we remember parts of our lives. And for me, I've been noticing that I remember stories kind of in strands. Like, this is my coming out story. This is my creative story. This is my friend's story. This is my boyfriend, whatever it is. But then you go, especially after you've been around for a couple decades, you go back and you think wait a second, that, and that were all happening at the exact same moment in time. They weren't separate stories. They were life. They were what was going on. So I think by the time my first book came out, I had probably just come out to my parents. I was, it was difficult. It was also kind of a funny story. So I was already beginning to tell it as a funny story, which can be helpful, right? If you honestly feel there's some aspect of it that is funny, which I did, because that's another thing I think about a lot, is the way I retell my own stories affects how I feel about myself.
But a lot of times we retell the stories with humor because they actually were painful.
Right. That's very helpful too. Being able to get to the point where you can tell a story with humor that was a purely painful one. Yes, I totally agree. That's also extremely important. And then there's other stories that are painful and you don't want to tell with humor. You don't need to. It like thinking about things like tools in an arsenal, right? And humor has always been a tool that I have been interested in applying, and that I sometimes have applied unconsciously. Sometimes I've applied consciously. Sometimes it's gotten me into something good. Sometimes it's gotten me into something bad emotionally, but I think about that a lot. So my first book was called The Houdini Box. I wrote it when I was 18 years old, freshman year of college, as part of a project at the Rhode Island School of Design, except it wasn't a children's book project. It was a sculpture project. And the assignment that week was to do an art project about the magician Harry Houdini, who by coincidence I loved when I was a kid. So I made a glass sculpture, three-dimensional sculpture of Houdini on stage. And as part of that project, because I loved Houdini as a kid, I wrote a story about a 10-year-old boy who gets to meet Houdini, which is what I would have wanted. But again, it was not intended for children. I did not want to make children's books when I was in college. I wanted to be a set designer for the theater. And the story, though, came to my mind, so I wrote it down. And then after college, when I was graduated and deciding I didn't want to go into the theater, that maybe, in fact, I should go into children's books, I remembered that story that I wrote when I was 18 about a kid who gets to meet Houdini. And I thought, okay, that wasn't written for kids, but maybe kids would like it. So I found the story in my closet. I rewrote it. I added some pictures, and that became my first book, The Houdini Box. And several years later, I was chatting with a friend of mine who's a queer theater director, and he asked me if I thought my work was queer. And at that point, I did not have any out gay characters in my stories. That did not happen until, as you mentioned, the Marvels, where there was a literal gay character. And in that book, it turns out everyone in the book is gay. But I did not have out gay characters. So a couple of years after I did the Houdini Box, I was saying this friend asked me if I thought my work was queer. And I was illustrating books by other writers. Some of them were very funny. Some, there were all different types of stories. But I said, no, I don't think my work is queer. And this friend literally laughed in my face. He said, Brian, your first book was about a kid who's obsessed with a man who can escape from anything, like closets. And nothing can keep him inside. He wants to be free. He wants to be himself. And I quite literally had not thought of anything like that. And, Harry Houdini tapped into an idea of escape that I think all human beings long for. But I believe as queer people, there's something particularly illuminating in that.
Well, and I loved Harry Houdini as a little girl, and I think I may have read that book, Brian, because I have children. I have, my children are now 22 to 34. We spend a lot of time in the library, and I'm like, is that book, like, in the back of my head? I'm like, I think I've read that book. But I read, yes, that makes a lot of sense.
No, I was going to just say that I was not thinking, I was never thinking about my father or coming out when I was making any of my books. Right? Except my father and coming out and my life are my life. And everything I do, everything we do is part of our lives, right? Many of us are good at compartmentalizing things. We're good at putting away things that are difficult, perhaps, that we don't want to deal with. Sometimes that's a really important survival mechanism. It is not a bad thing. But I think my friend's comment helped me recognize that everything I do is of one piece, that I still, to this day, when I write a story, I generally do not think about what the story is about. Thematically, what makes this person go over here, and why are we in this city, and what is the next thing that goes? It's very mechanical. It's like, like the pieces, it really is like the pieces of a clock or some kind of machine. So my dad died about 20 some odd years ago. Yeah, he was. And just after he died, I began working on the story that became The Invention of Hugo Cabret. And the one thing I knew about the story that I was writing was I did not want Hugo's father to die, because the way I justified it was I didn't want the character of Hugo to have to deal with
Grief.
that grief. It's not too hard to see what the actual issue may have been. Right. That was the first time where where I was conscious of my father's presence or absence in a book. And it didn't have to do with queerness. It had to do with death, I guess, and loss, and being a child and being a father. And my queerness, of course, is part of that story, but I didn't want to deal with grief. And so I wrote The Invention of Hugo Cabret for about a year, trying to figure out because I knew Hugo needed to end up on his own in the train station in order for the plot to work. So how do you get a kid? Okay, it's easy enough to have the mom die when Hugo's very small.
That's Disney's formula.
Right? It works. It worked well before Disney. It's worked. Dickens had a good handle on that.
Mother, because
it goes to the beginning of literature, right? And then again, like the reason orphans are so central to so many stories is because I believe it's because children know on some unconscious level or conscious level that they're going to grow up and have to be on their own. Mm-hmm. So to imagine a story where you have to do that now as a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, what would happen if you have to do that now? And of course, there are many, many real situations where children do find themselves in that kind of situation. But for a story, like for a story that's a metaphor, right? If you believe that all stories are metaphors on some level, then the metaphor of the orphan, which is different than the actuality of the orphan, is going to need to be, you're going to have to remove the parents. And so for Hugo, I had his mom die when he was very young, and I just didn't know what to do with the dad because I didn't want him to die. In this story, it was about the dad. So I was willing to make the dad the bad guy. Like I made the dad an alcoholic who like disappears on Hugo. Like somehow that seemed better than killing him. I remember, and yet again, I wrote most of the plot for The Invention of Hugo Cabret, but I remember there was a sense that in the center of that story, there was a hole. Something was missing. There was no emotional reason for Hugo to be doing what he's doing, to find this machine, to try to fix it, to get some kind of message that I didn't know what the message was. And I knew that message was going to lead to, all these other elements. I had all of that in place. And I remember the day I was sitting at my desk trying to figure out what to do when I realized Hugo's dad had to die. That the hole at the center of that story is Hugo's dad. Mm-hmm. And he needs to deal with that death. And of course, that meant I needed to deal with that death. So I cried, I burst into tears, and I started writing. And it was like the whole rest of the story. Like I said, I didn't know what the automaton was going to write or draw. That immediately came to me. It was immediately connected to the father. The father was able to fill in the emotional gaps that I had in place. So now when you read The Invention of Hugo Cabret, it hopefully feels very much like Hugo is grieving the loss of his father, and that drives him through the story. But I wrote it the opposite way around. I wrote the entire plot until I got to the emotional reason that drives the story. Mm-hmm. And I have found that happens again and again and again with my stories. I don't know why, but that's how I work. And I became conscious of it with my dad and Hugo's dad. And then I have dealt directly with grief and with families ever since. Mm-hmm. So when I was doing Wonderstruck, the book I did, it's about two deaf kids who run away from New York, one in the 20s, one in the 70s. One of the kids is also he's dealing with the death of a mother, but there's a father who he has never known, who his mother has essentially kept secret.
To find him,
so he's trying to find his father. And then in the Marvels, there's a kid who actually, my first non-orphan, he actually has both of his parents, but they're terrible and very, very distant and have sent him off to boarding school on his own. So there's a kind of artificial orphan feeling of being orphaned by a child whose parents have abandoned him emotionally. And then one other thing I'll add to this that I think is relevant to your question about my dad and coming out in my stories is that after The Invention of Hugo Cabret was published, an adult reader came up to me at a book reading and said to me, "I love that this story is about how we make our own families." And I made up the story. I wanted Hugo to be safe at the end. He has, Méliès and his wife become like parents or grandparents. Isabelle becomes like a sister, which is why I was very careful not to give them a proto-romance, because I always hate proto-heterosexual relationships in children in movies. Like boys and girls can just be friends.
Well, it's compulsory heterosexuality.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Like Jesus had to be married to Mary Magdalene.
Right.
They just be teacher and student.
Yeah, right.
Do they have to have a sexual relationship?
Right. No, they do not. So I was very cautious, careful and aware when I was writing the book. But as I just described, when I was writing the book, I thought, if you had asked me what the book was about when I was writing it, I'd say it's about a kid who lives in the walls of a train station who meets this mean old man who used to make movies. It wasn't until the reader said to me that this is a book about how we make our own families that I realized not only is that what this book is about, it's what all my work is about, and it's what I want all the rest of my work to be about in the future. So when I was writing Wonderstruck, I was very conscious of that idea, and there's a biological through line in the family that's discovered that connects the child to a blood relative that he did not know about, that helps him find himself. And then, but he also has a friend. He becomes friends with a boy in his travels, and he runs away and meets this boy. And they're 12, so it's a pre-sexual relationship, but there is something that bonds those two kids. And in my imagination, I don't write this, but I imagine that one of them grows up to be queer and one of them grows up to be straight. But at that moment, they find something in each other. And so there was something for me very queer in the story, even though that's not the text, it's the subtext. But for the Marvels, when I was writing the Marvels, as you observed, I was like, I am writing about queer people, and I am writing
about. You wrote about AIDS too, which is not a typical subject for a children's book. So did you get any pushback about that at all when you started saying, or are you so established now that like if you come forward with an idea, they're like, yeah, go do it?
Well, that's a tricky question that I don't know if I can answer fully, but my perspective is less about being established and more about having a good relationship with the people who I work with. So I have an editor who I trust. I have a publisher who loves my work and supports it. So when I was working on the invention of Hugo Cabret and the Marvels and Wonderstruck, I had been working with the same editor since my third book.
Well, and also too, you have readers now.
Yeah.
You have people that like look forward to your books and are excited to read them.
Yeah. So I know that.
And so you have people that are sort of, I would say, are used to your genre, like are used to your stories and are going on the ride with you because they trust you as an author.
Yeah, which I don't take for granted, but I also don't think about that when I'm writing, right? Like when I'm writing, I'm just trying to make up a story that works. But when I decided to set the Marvels in 1986, or part of the story I think it's 1986, the second half takes place in 1991, but then there's a flashback to the mid to late 80s when the AIDS crisis was on the rise. And when I realized that was the time period I was going to be writing about because of various other elements that were coming into place, because that book begins in 1766 and goes through 1900 with 5 generations of a family.
And theater family, right?
Yeah, and you see it all in pictures. And then this 1991 story is all in words. And because I knew I was going to be writing about queer people, and because I knew that this character who we were going to meet was going to turn out to have lost, have lost a partner, I realized that it made sense for that character to have died from AIDS, and for us to discover at a certain point that the main character, the older main character, is HIV positive. And then for the 12-year-old boy who is his nephew to sort of discover his uncle's love story, the story about this mysterious house where the uncle lives. And then there's a coda at the end of the book where we flash forward and see the boy as an adult. And we find out about his life and the idea that he's become a queer man who, in his childhood, AIDS was going to be part of the landscape. I knew that many young people today, are not taught about the AIDS crisis. And in order for me to make it clear what's happening, I would have to say the word AIDS at least once. In 1991, there was a book called Weetzie Bat by Francesca Lia Bloch. That was one of the first books that talked about the AIDS crisis in a very central way, and where at least one of the first books for me, and was one of the first books where the queer characters' queerness was just part of who they were. And it's written like a fairy tale, and the word AIDS is never mentioned. It talks about the poison in the blood, the danger in the blood, but every reader in 1991, whatever age, knew exactly what it was about. That's not the case today. And I knew I would need to find at least one place where I could talk about AIDS in a way that, and this is a challenge for all storytellers, is how do you get information across that doesn't sound like you're telling information, right?
Hey friends, we hope you're enjoying this episode of Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA plus stories. Now, Anne-Marie and author Brian Selznick had such a long and interesting conversation that we've decided to turn it into a two-part episode. So tune in again next Friday as Anne-Marie and Brian talk more about his work and the evolution of young adult fiction, writing about love and connection, and more. You can catch this and other episodes of Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA plus stories on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to Coming Out and Beyond LGBTQIA plus stories with Anne-Marie Zanzel. New episodes of the Coming Out and Beyond podcast drop every other Friday. You can tune in at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at annemariezanzel.com. Be sure to hit subscribe when tuning in so you never miss an episode. And for more resources, articles, videos, and a free downloadable guide for coming out later in life, visit annemariezanzel.com.